going to get back into our lectures and our Q&As. I'm sure it's different for all of you being, really into trade and business journalism, but for me, supply chain did not become a household word until, until 2020. And now I feel like even, my little sister knows at least roughly what it is. So we're going to hear about that today. We're also going to hear about another word that you keep hearing a lot, which is friendshoring. So we have two analysts to talk to us here today. Carlos Kuriyama is joining us from APEC, where he's a senior analyst, and his work involves trade, investment, regulatory and structural reforms. And then we also have Harrison Chang, who is joining us from Control Risks, where he focuses on Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, and here in Singapore. So we are going to have Carlos kick us off, and let's give them a hand.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for the kind invitation and the kind introduction. So thanks to all the organizers for this invitation. My name is Carlos Kuriyama, and I'm a senior analyst at the APEC Policy Support Unit in the APEC Secretariat. So in this occasion, just I would like to share some views about the current supply chain challenges in the Asia-Pacific region in the context of this pandemic. And something I would like also to mention is that what I will say today is just my personal view, and these are not the views of the APEC Secretariat or the views of any of the APEC member economies. So just a brief introduction about APEC. So we are 21 member economies. So we are 21 member economies all across the Pacific Rim, in the Asia side, in Oceania, and in the Americas. So all APEC members participate as economic entities, not as political entities. That's why we refer to all our members as economies and not as countries. And APEC is very important in the world. Why? Because it represents more or less, it explains more or less 50% of the world trade, 40% of the global population, and around 60% of the world GDP, the gross domestic product. What is what we do in APEC? So in APEC, what we try to do is to achieve some objectives that are related to sustainable development, equitable growth, and strengthening the sense of Asia-Pacific community. And on that sense, what we are doing is to use some economic drivers to achieve those goals. Those economic drivers are about trade and investment, like free and open and fair trade and investment systems. Also, it's about innovation and digitalization. And also what we are seeking is growth with certain attributes, right? The growth has to be balanced, sustainable, secure, inclusive, among other characteristics. So these are some of the things that we try to achieve in APEC. Something to note is that APEC, unlike the World Trade Organization or the United Nations, is a non-binding forum. It's voluntary and non-binding. And this has an advantage. What's the advantage? The advantage is that we could talk about economic issues in a more collegiate way without concerns that if we don't meet any of the things we say, we may end up in a dispute process. So this is not happening in APEC. Everything is done on a voluntary basis. So the core of APEC is basically trade. And since APEC inception in 1989, trade has grown up significantly in the Asia-Pacific region. So it has grown more than 7 times since APEC started. And at the same time, barriers to trade have been falling down. So at the beginning, for example, import tariffs were around 17% in 1989. Nowadays, they are between 5 and 6%. At the same time, what we have been able to do is to reduce trade costs. So we have been promoting initiatives to facilitate trade. In that sense, trade costs has been reduced in a way that we have saved several $1 billion for businesses. So what's going on with supply chain? So the pandemic started, and that complicated things for companies and created a lot of problems for supply chain. To start with, trade fell significantly. So the supply fell, demand fell. It was a big problem. That affected manufacturing. That affected global manufacturing. You can see that the lockdowns, social distancing, restrictions, border closures, etc., affected global supply chain. There were some initial problems, right, with the pandemic. Everybody, or not everybody, but a lot of people all in a sudden had to work from home. And so, with that, the demand for electronics went up. But the supply couldn't cope with that demand. So the prices of electronics went up significantly. Also, at the same time, some governments were concerned about shortages. And so many governments started to implement export restrictions to food, to other essential goods like medicines, personal protective equipment, and that created a lot of initial problems. Then those restrictions were removed little by little, and things started to improve. So, in terms of supply chain, what happened? What happened is this, that right now, the freight market rates, for a 40 TEU container is around between 6,000 to 7,000. And those prices are more than 4 times the prices that we had when the pandemic started. Actually, the prices were even higher. It's only in, I would say, early 2022 that the shipping costs started to go down. But we are not in pre-pandemic levels yet. And why this is? It's because basically, all in a sudden, there was no demand, so shipping companies decided to cut supply. The demand recovered. Now the demand has recovered, but what's happening with the supply is not recovering at the same pace. So now the cost is falling as the supply is recovering, but we are not there yet. This is another way we can see the problems in supply chain logistics. If we look at the global average delays for late vessel arrivals, we notice that at the beginning of the pandemic, the average delay was about 4.75 days. Now it's about 6 days, 7 days. So there are still issues with supply chain, connectivity issues, not enough vessels, not enough container capacity. Another problem that we are facing is inflation. So the year-on-year inflation is going up despite increases in interest rates by central banks. And why this is happening? The demand is recovering faster than supply. We have other issues that in order to help the economies recover, many central banks implemented some policies of quantitative easing. So there's a lot of money in the market. But the thing is, where to spend, at what speed people want to spend that money, or companies want to spend that money. And the other problem, we know that, is geopolitical challenges. So with geopolitical challenges, we are having some problems with the supply of oil, the supply of food, and this is contributing to these inflationary problems. And this is affecting supply chain logistics, of course. And to put this into the pandemic perspective, let me give you one example about vaccines. to produce, to distribute, and to administer a vaccine is a very complex process. We need a lot of ingredients, a lot of components, a lot of parts. We only need one of those components, parts, or pieces with supply chain issues, problems, and the whole thing could be spoiled. We will have problems on either production, distribution, or administration. Can you imagine the labs have the capacity to produce the vaccine, the substance, but what would happen if there are not enough glass vials? How can we store, transport the vaccine? It's going to be a problem. The vaccine supply chain is very, very, very sensitive, and supply chain has to work perfect. Otherwise, we have problems. So, what are firms doing now? So, firms are trying to switch from a model of supply chain efficiency to supply chain resilience. So, before the pandemic, it was all supply chain efficiency. It was basically just in time process. It was about reducing costs, having large profits, and having, I would say, very low inventories. Nowadays, companies are saying we need to think more about supply chain resilience. So in that way, they have to build a system that has to be resilient, strong enough to withstand shocks. It has to be able to recover from those shocks and able to leverage from different options. So it's important to, for example, diversify sources, have those sources close to headquarters or to the production hubs. And also we need to build redundancies. So we need to build adequate surplus capacity. At the end, there's going to be a trade-off. The trade-off is going to be long-term resilience versus short-term profits. So at the end of the day, it's important to have resilience, but resilience is costly. That's something that we need to keep in mind. So what firms are doing more specifically? One of the things that they are doing is to do some reshoring and nearshoring. So to have all the production processes closer to the markets they are serving or to the headquarters. They are also moving from what we call the just-in-time model to just-in-case inventory management. So that is basically having additional stocks, precautionary stocks, building redundancies, diversifying suppliers, among other things. And also what firms are doing is to improve supply chain visibility. What is this? This is not just to look at the market sentiments and the market reactions, but it's also about tracking parts, components, and products from the manufacturers all the way to the final destination, right? So this is being done to try to basically have some savings to make the resiliency more efficient. And this is my final slide. So right now the situation is bringing us a lot of uncertainties on supply chain. And it's in this context that the role of regional cooperation is very important. The pandemic is a global problem and requires global solutions. Supply chain is also a global issue and requires global solutions. In this sense, within APEC, we are discussing a number of initiatives that could help to improve supply chain, global supply chains in general. So one of the things we are doing is to promote digitalization and supply chain visibility using digital platforms, for example, to track products. We are also promoting, improving, finding ways to improve trade facilitation. For example, things that we are doing is to accelerate implementation of the WTO trade facilitation agreement. Also, what we are doing is to promote the use of single windows in which firms can export or import products by presenting the documentation in just one place. Also, what we are doing is to redouble efforts in terms of structural reforms, implementing structural reforms. So what we would like to do is to implement market-based solutions to make the markets more resilient, more efficient. And finally, we're trying to boost regional cooperation on trade connectivity and economic openness. And one of the ways that we are doing is to encourage governments to have commitments to keep borders open, to avoid the implementation of import and export restrictions. So that could facilitate the flow of essential goods like food, medicines, and parts and components of the global value chain of many products. So this is what we are doing now. So thank you so much for your attention, and look forward to engage with you in a discussion later on. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Harrison. Thanks Anne for inviting me to this session. I come from Control Risks, which is a UK headquartered consultancy that helps businesses manage and mitigate risks. We focus, at least in my team, we focus quite a lot on looking at political and regulatory risk facing businesses operating in various parts of the world. For my team, it's Asia Pacific. And I have a specific focus on Southeast Asia, which is what I'll be talking about today. So I'm going to time myself to make sure it's efficient. So today I'm going to be focusing on supply chains and what we call friendshoring, the lingo that has sort of come into the discourse. And it's consisting of three components. The first is looking at supply chain alternatives, particularly in Southeast Asia. There's been a lot of talk recently about Southeast Asia as an alternative base for production. So I'll explore why Southeast Asia, why the interest now, and then I'll move on to the second part where we talk about this idea of supply chain relocation to Southeast Asia. It's talked about a lot, but what's the catch? Why aren't we seeing it actually happen as much as it's been talked about? So I'll talk a bit about the sort of complicating factors and trade-offs that businesses will have to consider and are considering as they talk about Southeast Asia. And finally, about friendshoring. What is it? How does it look like? And will it actually work for businesses in Southeast Asia? So looking at the supply chain landscape in Southeast Asia, in general, historically, it has been a key manufacturing for export base for many businesses, MNCs, foreign companies, in various sectors there. So in places like, for example, Thailand's eastern seaboard or Peninsular Malaysia, for example, and now increasingly in Vietnam, in Indonesia, you see companies moving in to set up production bases. And I mean, as an example, these production bases are already wholly, significantly integrated into global supply chains for key products such as semiconductors. And the advantages are really the strategic geographical location of Southeast Asia, proximity to large markets like China, India. There's been continued government investment in infrastructure expansion, despite the kind of political flux you see in some of the markets here. And finally, it's a pro-free trade orientation. So perhaps in contrast to some other parts of the world where we're seeing a rise in economic nationalism, Southeast Asia has been moving forward with more momentum than before, looking at, for example, RCEP, CPTPP, despite the US withdrawal from TPP under former President Donald Trump. And the main locations for where companies have historically based their supply chain and production are in those countries for various sectors. So why the interest now? Actually, this talk about supply chain relocation, I mean, I'm sure most of you are already aware, it's not new. And I sort of tried to contextualize it in three kind of waves, which are not necessarily distinct, more overlapping. But the first wave of interest really came before the pandemic with the U.S. China trade war. And clearly the the benefit was to try and avoid some of these retaliatory trade tariffs. And what I mentioned there, the popularization of a China plus one strategy. So having a lot of production based in China, but thinking of some alternative base in Southeast Asia. And I mentioned that at least as a potential option because it has been talked about a lot, but actually when you look at the evidence on the ground, there have not been that many, it's not been as popular as it's been discussed. The second wave of interest was really during the pandemic, really to mitigate the over-reliance on a single production base when it came under lockdown, for example. And the variations in pandemic management, that means different countries dealing with COVID in different ways, meant that there was a possible way to perhaps mitigate some of these risks by shifting production tactically to one site over another to avoid prolonged lockdowns. And the third wave of interest, I guess, started this year when a lot of businesses started to voice concern about China's COVID-19 policies, the dynamic zero COVID. And at this point, there has been a lot of impetus towards thinking about possibly relocating out of China entirely or more credibly thinking about, again, the China plus one option. But Southeast Asia is not a perfect substitute for China. There are many reasons why, and a lot of them are obvious. There are pull factors there, as you say, infrastructure, lower labor costs, sizable domestic markets, market access potential through trade pacts like RCEP, generous foreign investor incentives for relocating production into Southeast Asia, and also an ongoing shift towards higher value manufacturing. So in things like robotics, biopharmaceuticals, EVs, especially electric vehicles. But there are trade-offs. One key one is labor. Again, the labor market in Southeast Asia is not as large and not as highly skilled as that in China. There are forced labor allegations in various Southeast Asian countries, and these have earned export bans by the U.S. As well as the withdrawal of trade preferences by the EU. Again, this leads to the second point about ESG considerations. As ESG becomes more and more talked about, there is that component where companies need to think about. Integrity challenges, again, corruption is still an issue operating in some of these countries. So that leads to hidden costs of doing business. And finally, the bureaucratic inefficiency. So these are some of the trade-offs that companies usually think about. So friendshoring, what does it mean? What is it supposed to achieve? It's also referred to as ally shoring, allied shoring, and it's about choosing countries to locate your production activities or to source your inputs from based on similarity in what is defined as strategic and geopolitical interests. And the aims are really to mitigate the risk of supply chain cuts from single source countries, most often talked about in the context of China, but not restricted to China. And the other aim is really to rebuild the economic and strategic relationships between the US and the other countries. So what might it look like, or what actually does it look like within the context of Southeast Asia? One way in which I see friendshoring possibly happening is in relation to the kind of sizable deposits of raw materials that are critical to the manufacture of electronics. So for example, for the EV sector, including the production of EV batteries, high-tech electronics, these are places in Southeast Asia, as I mentioned on the right-hand side, key material deposits in Southeast Asia, where companies might think about basing their location within the country so that they can source these materials without having to rely on an extended supply chain. And the potential interested parties, as in the companies, the countries where companies might be thinking of this are Australia, Japan, South Korea. And we've seen some of them enter into some significant investments in Southeast Asia, looking at, for example, a South Korean EV battery maker teaming up with a host of Indonesian state-owned enterprises for a mining, processing, and manufacturing project in the EV sector. And these are some recent examples. So often these involve joint ventures or partnerships with state-owned companies or local politically connected conglomerates in Southeast Asia. These typically enjoy quite a significant role in their economies, and therefore the state, the governments in this sector would not easily want to sort of give it up and allow the foreign company to essentially wholly own the entity. So this needs to be a strategic, there needs to be strategic buy-in basically from the local governments as well for this to work. But there are again several considerations. Extraction costs, even when many of these countries are being talked about as possible sites where you could set up some mining production, mining activities, for example, the cost of extraction are actually extremely high. Again, there's that labor risk. Environmental backlash is another key issue in Southeast Asia. So even though governments may seem to be quite supportive of some of these investments, we've seen projects hampered because of environmental NGOs and activists and local communities rising up and lobbying the government to intervene. And in some of these cases, we've seen governments cancel, indefinitely suspend projects for years on end. And therefore, there are those costs and risks that investors need to consider. Finally, about resource nationalism. So one key example would be Indonesia, right? A key country when you talk about nickel mining in Southeast Asia. But Indonesian government has also previously enacted nickel export bans to promote the growth of local industries in relation to nickel. So on the right-hand side, you can see, especially I highlight EVs and electric batteries, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and some of those sites. And the other side would be about rare earths, which has major, various end users in the medical sector, in the defense sector. Yeah. So actually, how compelling is friendshoring in Southeast Asia as an option? The appeal will really vary from case to case. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, cliche as that may sound. Because the range of options, if you have to limit your supply chain options to only those countries that have strategic and geopolitical sort of symmetries with the country from which you are headquartered, for example, the range of options is narrow. And it's also likely to be more costly. And it's also difficult, actually, to fully predict how stable geopolitical alliances are. Within Southeast Asia, you see there's a lot of political turmoil, changes of government, changes in administration. There is continuity, but different changes in government can bring about, changes in foreign policy priorities and who they see as a strategic partner. And so you have to sort of track and monitor this over time for it to really work. And friendshoring is something, if you have to relocate your production base, it's not a minor decision. And for Southeast Asian governments, actually, how compelling is friendshoring? They are going to capitalize on the rhetoric to attract FDI. They are not going to give up on the opportunity. But to what extent are they going to exclusively enable access for companies from a certain country simply because of their strategic relationship between the two? Unlikely. They are not doing it right now. Even as Indonesia welcomes U.S. and Australian companies in, they are setting up joint ventures with Chinese companies in nickel mining. They are not going to sideline or disadvantage investors. And so they're going to be friends to all. And again, there is that persistent concern within the region among the governments, despite what you hear about the IPEF and all that, about the depth and nature of U.S. commitment to the region. And that will sort of temper the kind of expectations that Southeast Asian governments will have to the idea of, sort of reserving those investment opportunities only for companies that come from strategic partners. And yes, that is my last slide. And I'm very happy to take any questions after that. But thank you for listening to me today.
Any questions for Carlos or for Harrison?
Hi, Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. For sort of both your topics, friendshoring and trade, trade resilience, both are interesting because neither of them are sort of the quickest or the cheapest way to do things, at least in the pre-pandemic, pre-geopolitical instability world. So it kind of goes a little bit against companies' interests to do it. My question is, how much have we actually seen so far of both these trends? How much are we actually seeing companies sort of going against the cheapest bottom line options and engaging in these far more long-sighted trading practices?
Thank you very much for your question. I think some companies are starting to basically reconsider. I mean, if the initial strategy was correct. So the pandemic started, and they noticed that they were having some problems. I mean, to get to customers and also to get from suppliers in order to produce. So as the barriers that were implemented because of the pandemic were, being put aside, some companies didn't go back to old practices. They decided to do something new. So some governments have been even providing some incentives to companies if they could, transfer some production facilities back to the headquarters, right? Or to relocate some branches to places closer to headquarters. So this has been happening. Also, I think there have been some trade tensions at the same time, and in that way, some companies don't want to be affected by certain possible sanctions or any sort of political decision that could affect their operations. And so they want to be safe, and they want to diversify their risk, and therefore having some production plants or suppliers in other areas. So we are seeing some of these activities, but how much of that is it happening? Is this something that is going to be sustainable or not? I wish I had a crystal ball, really. I don't have it. Thank you.
Yeah. As I mentioned just now, we have seen that kind of relocation over the past few years, even pre-pandemic, and most of it went to Vietnam, largely because of the political stability and also kind of a economically progressive development model that was pursued by the CPB. Vietnam still remains a hot destination, but it's becoming more and more crowded now, which is why companies are now moving towards Indonesia. Malaysia and Thailand have always been there, not the first option, because they are really mature markets, and some MNCs have been there for decades with their manufacturing operations. So it's not exactly an extremely lucrative market to get into compared to Vietnam, which is growing at an incredible rate. But we continue to see that happening. That being said, actually, for all the talk of foreign companies having their anxiety, given what's happening in China with the COVID-19 policy, on the ground, when we talk to some of our clients, their anxiety is very much tempered. They see the long-term view, and actually, we're getting market entry work for China at this point when so much of the rhetoric is about, we have to leave China right now. That's not happening. And they're still going to base most of their production in China. At least that's my take, without that crystal ball. They're still going to base a lot of their production in China because that's where the labor force is. That's where this significant quantity of skilled labor is. And think about that China plus one strategy to source maybe 10-20% of that production.
Shruti from Bloomberg Delhi. So, taking forward Ben's question, he said, is there some data to show that, these many companies have actually, moved on to China plus one policy? And if they have, do you think this is going to be a permanent thing? If it's permanent, then what kind of time frame do you see for this to actually, fructify on ground?
So no, there is anecdotal data, but as in if you're thinking about kind of a comprehensive database, not that I know of. So what we've tried to do on our part is to sort of understand, how popular is it, how much of it is happening. Is really to take all these anecdotes and do a proper assessment based on what we see, based on our conversations with clients, really to assess that. So unfortunately, we don't have that kind of hard data to say that. What we have tried to do is to extract as much from that data as we can in terms of understanding the motivations of business, understanding the nuance that they are placing in those considerations. So they're not going to be sold by headlines or you know, just the usual rhetoric, but they're going to be thinking very concretely, does this strategy apply to my sector? Are my competitors doing the same thing? Are they already thinking about it? Should I then do the same? Does it work for my supply chain? Because supply chain for different products is going to be different. Some are really extended, some are very, very short and can be localized in a single country. So as for whether it's permanent, it's really hard, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell because I think for some people, when they look at what's happening in China, it might indeed be a short-term thing that will eventually evaporate by next year. You know, depending on China's search for its own domestic mRNA vaccine that could then allow that transition to endemicity. So those are some of the key indicators we are tracking ourselves to understand, you know, whether this is going to be a permanent or a short-term thing.
Okay. Just one more thing. Is South Asia and especially India being looked at seriously when companies think of China plus one? And if not, then why?
I mean, my thing is that no matter what's the current situation, companies will always be trying to find the place where they feel is the best place to have their operations. And in history, this keeps evolving and companies keep changing places. Let me give you just one example, right? In the early 1950s, 1960s, right? In Asia, Japan was the main, I would say, manufacturing hub, right? They were starting to produce a lot of textiles, and then they moved to motorcycles and automobiles. But then what happened? I mean, as labor costs were increasing, textiles were no longer produced in Japan. So where they moved? They moved to Korea, for example. But then, once Korea started getting more and more expensive, they moved to Southeast Asia. Then they moved to China. Now, where is textiles ending being produced? South Asia, and in some specific countries in Southeast Asia, right? Something similar has been happening to other industries, even in the case of cars, right? It's not everything is produced in Japan. There are some cars that are produced, for example, in Thailand. China also is producing cars. So this is all started to, this is all changing constantly. And it will probably continue. That's my take.
Hi, I'm Hee-jin from Bloomberg News. I'm based in Seoul, South Korea, and I cover EV and batteries. And then, as you know, Janet Yellen mentioned friendshoring during her visit to LG last week. And I was just wondering if you think it could be faster to find the alternatives rather than China to seek the rare earth in terms of like lithium is the most important metal for batteries, but you didn't mention anything about lithiums. So I was wondering where we can find the other, what kind of countries can develop lithiums rather than China, and then whether it would be that easy because China is all handling those like dirty jobs in terms of developing metals, and they're taking all the ESG problems in developing those precursors and sort of like that. And all of those upstreams of the batteries are still wholly depending on China, especially for South Korean battery makers. So actually, I talked to LG just 2 days ago in the middle of this workshop, and I told the executive, like, hey, these days the issue is supply chain, and I'm now listening all these great sessions, and they said this kind of, this is long-term project in terms of developing metals, and everyone is trying to develop lithiums and metals, and he said, okay, where? And I said, oh, I heard Canada and doing that, and Japan is doing that, and US, and yeah, so when? Oh, 10 years later, and he said like, yeah, so that's why we are still depending on China. So I just want to know how fast it could be for us to find the other countries in metals and,
I think the Southeast Asian governments are thinking long term. They obviously have to recognize the reality of how these supply chains are already embedded, right? A lot of it is in China. If we talk about rare earths, that's that situation is even more stark. But these are kind of first steps in trying to establish themselves as alternative locations. So in short, it's going to be a long time frame. It's going to be like 5-10 years. And don't forget, along the way, it's probably not going to be a very smooth process. It depends on a lot of factors. It depends ultimately on policy continuity. And that in turn depends on political stability. And in some countries, you can say it's gonna stay the same. Vietnam is going to stay the same. Cambodia is going to stay the same. But in others, I mean, Malaysia, even Thailand, Indonesia to some extent is somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. Looking at 2024, Jokowi. But yeah, I think you would have to sort of consider the extent to which political change is or is not going to affect their policy, and whether they will stick to those commitments. And also importantly, as governments change, as you sort of try and forecast, as governments change, will the next government respect the investment decisions that were made by the previous government, or are they going to dredge them up as ways to sort of attack the credibility of their opponents? So in some places, actually, despite possible changes of government, actually both sides of the parliamentary aisle see eye to eye on the need for foreign investments in these critical strategic sectors. That has pluses in terms of continuity. That means they're going to continue to offer those generous investment incentives, like corporate tax exemptions for like 10 years, 15 years. But the flip side of it is also the idea about resource nationalism. The more they're invested in it, the more they see it as a critical sector that they need to protect. And then they'll start thinking even more long term. How are we going to develop our local industry to try and really ensure that we capture most of the supply chain within the country? And that's where foreign investors will likely have to negotiate with governments if they want to continue that long-term investment. And they need to be prepared for it today. They can't wait 10 years later and we'll see how it goes. They need to consider the fact that it's possible that the government is going to push on those things, and then how are you going to navigate and negotiate that?
Yeah, and the reality is that, if companies cannot buy the rare earths from one place, they will try to find it from somewhere else, because otherwise they cannot produce. It will cost more, but they will have to do it. But about rare earths, there are many right now projects to develop rare earths in Australia, Canada, and even in South America, all the way to Chile and Bolivia. So companies are actively looking for it. Yeah.
Mala and then Sule.
Thank you. My question is linked to that question. Which governments are actually offering subsidies for companies that bring their manufacturing home from China? That is one question. I have another question to know. The recent WTO conference, they have discussed on supply chain issues, food supply chain issues for pandemic support. And member countries agreed to not to impose any restriction for food supply chain issues. So do you think this will play any role to make the supply chain smooth in this among these WTO members?
Definitely it is. These commitments are certainly helping to boost the supply. So there's evidence about that. So in terms of the subsidies, believe it or not, it's not just one or two governments that implement subsidies. There are several databases that are available where we can see all these non-tariff barriers measures, like Global Trade Alert, or even WTO. It has an information management portal. You will have a look, and you will see that the most common non-tariff measure is either an export subsidy or a subsidy affecting import production. Any sort of, government aid, bailout subsidies, etc., concessional loans, however you want to see the subsidy. Many of those measures are hidden, and it's not very easy to find it out. But there are, it will take us a lot of time, I mean, to name all those governments that are implementing those measures.
I mean, the ones I see, the ones I'm more familiar with, I think Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia have openly talked about that and you know, laid out the kind of incentives. So for example, Malaysia, one key area is in Kuantan, in Perak, where Chinese companies have quite a lot of manufacturing investments there. For Thailand, it would be the Eastern Economic Corridor, you know, the flagship investment zone launched by Prayut. So on the eastern seaboard, where Chinese and Japanese investors are actually have the largest presence there right now, yeah, as well as on Indonesia. But yeah, I agree with Carlos. I mean, actually, I think in most of these governments will probably have some form or shape of incentive to try and attract companies to relocate.
To Harrison, your clients, those who are looking into going to China, what sector are they from and where are they looking to go into China? And to Carlos, what are the economies thinking about the recent IPEF and all these frameworks and all these friendshoring? Is there an appetite for it, or are they more interested in the hard stuff like the multilaterals and the FTAs? Those serve them better purposes than these frameworks. So perhaps you can talk to China.
The short answer is I don't have those sectors on hand, but I can get back to you. But that's broadly what we're seeing with our clients in China.
I think companies have appetite for any sort of initiative that promotes, I mean, strengthening regional economic integration. Let me give you some evidence on that. I mean, in APEC, for example, we have the ABAC group, which is the APEC Business Advisory Council. And every year they are basically asking governments to do more work to push for the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So in terms of interest from the private sector to go multilateral or bilateral or regionally, I mean, they push all those tracks, but they are always conscious that the fastest track is the bilateral track. That's much easier to get an agreement and to sign something and to implement it. Then is the regional level, and the toughest, I mean, where it's very hard to achieve consensus, but it's possible, is a multilateral track. Yeah.
So, hello. My question, as Harrison, you mentioned in your presentation, like there are hidden costs, in terms of corruption. So is there, you think, any lack of regulations or strict regulations, rules and regulations, or are the workers or the persons who are involved in the corruption, they didn't get good amount for their services, so they are forced to do that?
I mean, it's hard to generalize, but I would say the anti-corruption frameworks across Southeast Asia are generally quite robust when you look at them on paper. But in practice, these regulations are not always enforced, are not always followed. And in large part is due to, well, it's complex in the sense that some of it is seen as part of the traditional way of doing business. And in some of these places, they don't see it as corruption. They see it as a way of returning a favor or something like that. Yeah, sorry.
So, like yesterday, we went to PSA and they were talking about the new way they are bringing in the supply chain, the robotic work. You think it reduced whenever it happens, like it reduced the way of corruptions?
Sorry,
like,
this is relating
the less man work, human involvement in all the process.
Yeah, so I think this ties into what Carlos mentioned about the digitalization of supply chains. So I think, so various Southeast Asian governments are trying to digitalize both the public sector operations. For example, Malaysia wants to get all of its government agencies on this mega cloud platform by 2024, I think. And even certain aspects of the business process, particularly in the import and export process, the customs process, where some of these integrity challenges are faced, governments are increasingly turning to digitalization of these operations, and it makes it a lot more transparent and easier for businesses to access without having to face some of these challenges. But again, we often caution, advise our clients, you have to be prepared for certain situations where this could happen, and we sort of map out, who within the government, who within the apparatus could you possibly encounter some of these challenges, what are the consequences if you actually say no, we don't, what are some resistance strategies that you could possibly use, because we know other companies have tried it. They may be able to do business. Sometimes they just have to accept the cost of not paying, and that's fine. They are willing to do that because they want to maintain the integrity of their operations. And sometimes it's a business decision at the end, a commercial decision. If you can't do business in this place entirely cleanly, then maybe it's just not possible to do business. And then they make a decision and then they move on. They find somewhere else where they can. And I think governments do increasingly recognize that they have to address this, which is why they've been rolling out guidelines for companies to abide by anti-corruption, ethics standards, for specific sectors and across the business landscape.
Thank you.
Hello, Marta from Tata Data Indonesia. I have one question. Actually, our country, the government is trying to, as you speak before, the government is trying to build the EV industry, and then they are trying to, of course, build the end-to-end industry. And the question is, do you think any barriers that to realize that that will? Because it's for me it's quite ambitious. For several years we don't really have an end-to-end industry. We are in the supply chain, and it's really minimum. Our role is really minimum. So this would be the first ambitious project in Indonesia. So do you see any barriers about that? Thank you.
You refer to EV, right? Electric vehicles, right?
Yes, EV.
Okay, this is my take. I think it's going to be successful as long as this is a personal take, as long as the government is committed to reduce subsidies to the alternative, right? What's the alternative? Is it traditional traditional energy, the utilization of traditional fuels, right? I mean, if the subsidies made the price of fuel very low, people are not going to buy electric vehicles, and it's not going to be attractive then to produce those electric vehicles. But if those subsidies are removed, I mean, the government will have some additional funds that could be used, to develop the electric vehicle industry. So I think we have to see the other side too in order to determine if this is going to be successful or not at the end.
Yeah, the fuel subsidy thing is clearly a sensitive issue for many governments.
Yes.
To the point where they have had to tell their population that honestly we just don't have the money to continue funding this indefinitely. And all of them are probably hoping this inflation thing is just going to peak, it's going to end by the end of this year, and they can get back to refocusing some of their funding and investments to encouraging EV take-up and production.
Final question goes to Thu.
Hello, I'm Thun from Vietnam. I have a question. I think that the one factor also important to supply chain resilience is mental well-being of managers and employees. During pandemic time, people felt isolated. Working environment broke down. So do you think this is also an important factor to the resilience, and how a company will deal with that in the next crisis?
The mental, for example, the mental health was, I think, one of the factors why we had some issues, some problems in supply chain, right? We had a lot of cargo vessels, and the seafarers, they basically could not, I mean, leave the ship for several months. They arrive to a port finally, and they are not authorized to disembark. And so that forced many seafarers to quit the industry, right? And also, when they had the chance to disembark, in order to embark again, they had to meet some very strict requirements, and they had to stay in port or in that city for so many days, testing negative, and then they are authorized again to embark. So mentally, it was very, very, very hard. And I think that the lesson learned is that companies, we need to, I mean, improve testing, also to build redundancies, having more staff and attract staff to work in those sectors. It's not that easy. It's costly. That's the point. But certainly these are some of the lessons that we are learning, and hopefully, I mean, governments and private sector will be able to take into account when the next time comes, you know. Yeah.
I mean, my point would be exactly what Carlos said. We hope that the governments have learned over the course of the past 2 years plus how exactly to implement COVID-19 curbs, restrictions, without having to always resort to lockdowns, which were extremely damaging in terms of mental health. And we do see that in Southeast Asia, in other parts of Asia as well, governments have become a lot more judicious in their use of these measures, a lot more targeted, localized. They have, smoothened out some kinks in the testing process, the quarantine process, and the net impact of that would then, hopefully in the future, the risk of something like 2020 happening again would be low. But it takes two hands to clap. So private sector also has to understand that this culture of whether it's work from home or a more healthier balance between managing work and life, I guess. They have to be willing to also take up that mandate, for it to actually work and prevent the same kind of situations that we saw.
Carlos and Harrison, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today.